In this video, we'll discuss emergency services, critical infrastructure threats, attacks, and mitigation strategies. This video is brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. NCyTE Center and this material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation. My name is Philip Kreger. I'm a professor of cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. So this is the second in the series on emergency services cybersecurity. So the first thing we need to do is to kind of do a quick review of emergency services that I covered in the first video. Then we'll discuss cyber threats to emergency services, recent attacks on emergency services, and finally mitigation strategies, and then a quick wrap-up. So recall that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency defined 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States. Emergency services sector is one of these critical infrastructures. Emergency services sector is a community of millions of highly skilled, trained personnel along with physical and cyber resources that provide a wide range of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery services during both day-to-day operations and incident response. And by the way, I live in Florida, and tomorrow we're going to get a Category 4 hurricane, so emergency services will be very important to our area. So when we say emergency services, what exactly are we talking about? What comprises this emergency services? Well, there's really 5 different areas, including emergency management, and you notice the hurricane icon right there. We have law enforcement, public works, fire and rescue services, and emergency medical services. Emergency services is a complex system of interconnected systems at the local, state, and federal level. Emergency services is dependent upon other critical infrastructure sectors. Now recall, we've already discussed this in several other videos about critical infrastructure sectors, is that they're not standalone silos, but they're all very highly reliant upon one another. So what are some of these interdependencies? Well, it includes energy. Fuel and electric power are essential for operations and the ability of critical infrastructure to respond to emergencies. We have communications. Radio spectrum networks and infrastructure enable emergency services to carry out its mission. Transportation systems. Secure and effective movement of goods and personnel over multiple modes is required for emergency response and recovery. And if you've looked at the videos on NCyTE's YouTube channel, you'll see that we've already covered energy, communications, and several different forms of transportation systems in videos. There's also water. Water is critical for sustaining communities and infrastructure before, during, and after emergencies. Healthcare and public health. First responders and EMS emergency management services coordinate with the healthcare sector to respond to emergencies. And finally, information technology. A variety of cyber-related assets, systems, and disciplines are increasingly essential to help ESS carry out its mission. So what are potential threats to emergency services? Well, as we talked about in the first video, there are really 3 primary components of emergency services. There's the physical, there's the cyber, and there's the human, but we're only going to concentrate on the cyber. So the cyber includes the hardware and software components that are critical to supporting the mission, including computers, servers, database, and other IT systems and assets used in activities, and typically fulfill one of 4 roles. And those roles include access control, limits physical access to defined areas of a facility to authorized personnel and visitors only, control systems, which monitor and control sensitive processes and physical functions, warning and alert, which send alerts and notifications with critical information that triggers protection and response actions. And finally, we have data collection systems, which collect data for record retention and information sharing. So this was pulled from 2018. There was a cyber attack that disrupted Baltimore's emergency first responders. The attack lasted 17 hours, which forced responders to switch to manual methods. So what do we mean by manual methods? Back in March of 2018, over the weekend, unknown threat actors temporarily caused a shutdown of Baltimore's automated dispatch system. So essentially, when you call 911, that connects to an operator who identifies who you are and what kind of help you need, whether you need an ambulance or police or the fire department. And then that particular entity is forwarded to your location. But according to the office, the cyber attack was launched on Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m., impacting the messaging functions within the computer-aided dispatch system used by both the city's 911 and 311 services. Computer-aided dispatch is used to automatically divert calls to the closest emergency responders in order to make assistance in emergencies as efficient and quickly as possible. Manually taking phone calls and details is far slower, as you can imagine. The limited breach forced responders to abandon automatic systems and transition to manual mode in order to keep operating. That is, they could no longer rely upon their computers for the computer-aided dispatch. This effectively means that instead of details of incoming callers seeking emergency support being relayed to dispatchers electronically, they were relayed by the call center support staff manually. So imagine you're in a situation, you've just had a major car wreck or one of your family members had a heart attack. So you call 911 and instead of getting a very quick response, which could be 5, 10, maybe 20 minutes, everything is slowed down. Everything had to be done manually, which delays that response. Back in 2020, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency released cyber risks to 9/11. TDoS fact sheet. What is TDoS? Well, it's telephony denial of service attacks. And I'll discuss in more depth what a denial of service attack is shortly. TDoS present a unique risk to public safety communication stakeholders, including emergency communication centers, public safety answering points, and other 9/11 dispatch centers. TDoS events overload communications network elements with telephone calls, disrupting a jurisdiction's ability to provide emergency response services. Since this is the second video, I'm assuming that you all have discussed in one of your classes the concept of distributed denial of service or just denial of service attacks, but it's essentially that, only we're doing it over the telephony network. And so the threat here is the overwhelming volume of calls or sessions to a network element. The vulnerability is the operational or technical deficiency that enables a cyber incident. That is, the system is not capable of handling an infinite number of incoming connections. The consequence is the degradation or disruption of 9/11 call answering capabilities. The risk here, exploitations of vulnerabilities to disrupt or degrade 9/11 service. So in this instance, the TDoS, mobile phones may facilitate these events, commonly using non-subscriber phones or mobile robot networks known as botnets, which we've discussed before. All mobile service providers must connect 911 calls even if a phone is disconnected from a cellular service, that is, a non-subscriber. So the non-subscriber mobile phones may not provide detailed identifying or location information, obscuring the origin of calls. Large numbers of inexpensive used or prepaid phones can enable a TDoS event. And these are some things that I picked up off the internet. Now, I don't know if these are botnets, but it certainly looks like that. But in each instance, is you have many dozens and perhaps hundreds, at least on the left-hand side, of mobile phones that are connected to the internet, which then can be used to trigger a TDoS event, shutting down 9/11 operations. Now you think about it, that looks really expensive and exhausting, but you can rent these. How much it costs to rent a botnet to create a distributed denial of service attack. And right down here at the bottom, let's look at how much it costs. The price to rent 1,000 infected computers, or in this case mobile phones, in the US costs $180. If the hosts are located in the United Kingdom, the price is $240. France and Russia both cost $200, Canada costs $270, and 1,000 infected computers or phones located around the world cost $35. There's a daily limit of 20,000 hosts. So you don't have to purchase the cell phones. All you have to do is have sufficient capital to rent those botnets. So what is a distributed denial of service attack, or in this case, a telephony denial of service attack? Here we have the scenario where we have the victim, which in this instance would be an emergency services, for example, 911 or 311, and then we have an attacker on the bottom right-hand corner, and then we have these things called Internet of Things devices. And essentially, that's anything that has a networking capability that attaches to the internet. So you can think of your phones or routers or smart thermostats, smart refrigerators, anything that's a computer that connects to the internet. So this bad actor, as we see, the attacker, controls anywhere from, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000 of these Internet of Things devices. And so the attacker has the capability of taking these Internet of Things devices, and by the way, the reason that this attacker can do that is because they've been infected with some sort of malware which allows the attacker command and control over these devices, and essentially the owner of the device has no clue that their devices have been taken over by a bad actor. But once that attacker has these devices, they can be commanded to connect to a particular victim. So in this instance, there's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these devices that are attempting to connect to a single victim, which is a server somewhere. So it could be a 911 operator. And normally, let's say the 911 operator can handle 10, 15, 20 connections at one time. Here we have 100,000 attempted connections, which means that the victim that is using the computer is overwhelmed. The computer can't accept 100,000 connections, which essentially means that service can no longer run. And that's essentially what a distributed denial of service attack is. So these DDoS attacks are attacks on availability, and we've discussed in several places where the segments or the aspects of information that we want to protect include confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That is, that the resources should be available when the user needs that resource. So in 2015, the Department of Homeland Security published the Emergency Service Sector-Specific Plan, which was to be updated 4 years later in 2019. I could not find an updated version of this plan. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what is available. So in this sector-specific plan, oh, by the way, every critical infrastructure sector has one of these sector-specific plans, but the few that we've looked at have been out of date. So this sector-specific plan lists some mitigation strategies. And it says all critical infrastructure sectors rely on security and availability of certain lifeline functions that are essential to sector operations. There we see that word availability again. These lifeline functions include aspects of communications. We have videos on that. Energy, we have videos on that. Transportation, we have a lot of videos on that. And water. Disruption in these lifeline functions not only may hinder the ability of the emergency services sector to perform its mission to serve, protect, and aid, but also may cause impacts that cascade to other sectors, services, or functions critical to communities, regions, or even the nation. In planning and preparing for and responding to emergencies, the ESS strives to mitigate the impacts of such disruptions through a variety of means. And these means include things like maintaining redundant communication systems and equipment for the continuous flow of emergency information. That is, if one system goes down, there should be a redundant system that can take its place. Coordinating fuel and power availability with energy sector partners for emergency services. So I suggest you go back and view the energy sector videos as well, so you understand how all of these sectors kind of are interdependent and need to be able to rely on each other. Leveraging emergency services sector assessment tools to identify available resources and potential lifeline function points of failure. We've also discussed this in other videos where we're talking about conducting a risk assessment. And the first thing when you do that is you need to identify all of your assets and then identify how critical those assets are to the functioning of the critical infrastructure sector as a whole. Developing and implementing mutual aid mechanisms between emergency services disciplines and sectors that provide lifeline functions so that disruptions can be more readily absorbed and addressed. And finally, engaging in robust training and exercises to expand the understanding of lifeline function disruption and consequences and establish effective mitigation practices. So that's again something that we've discussed in other videos, is that training and policy are extremely important, because cybersecurity is not just about the hardware. It's not just about the software. Part of cybersecurity is dealing with people and them being able to respond to particular incidents that occur. Training and policies are critical to the functioning of cybersecurity in all of the sectors. So let's review what we just discussed. We had a review of what comprises emergency services. We discussed a little bit about cyber threats to emergency services. We talked about recent attacks on emergency services and a little bit about mitigation strategies. And then we had this wrap up. This video was brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.